David, I loved your emphasis on ethics. That's what we all are here for that reason. Tell us, David, or anyone in the panel, what percentage of current tour operators do you believe give voice to such sentiments in their programs?
These are on. Based on my experience with operators, I don't think, Michael, I could give you really an accurate sense of that. I think maybe Kelly would probably be able to answer that question better than I, because she's so, not to put you on the spot here, Kelly, but
I'm happy to put Kelly on the spot.
From what I've seen, to give you a partial answer at least anyway, from what I've seen some pretty interesting things, and I've heard some pretty interesting things of operators putting snakes in bags and hiding them behind trees, and then when the next eco-tour groups come out the next week, going off trail and locating that bag and tracking that snake, pulling it out of the bag and pulling it out and showing it to the tourists.
I've experienced this.
About how wonderful a tracker this individual is, because we just wouldn't be able to see that snake otherwise. I've been to Mexico, and just before we entered the park and protected area, we had our operator take us to a farm. And at the farm, we saw 2 jaguars that are chained up in a garage. And the operator's comment was, David, the jaguar is such an elusive beast. We know that when you go to the park, you'll never see a jaguar, so we thought we'd bring you here to show you the jaguar. And so, I don't need to fill in the gaps.
I have experienced that as well.
Right. So, I've seen a lot of nasty things out there. I don't think that I've ever, in terms of where I think we need to go as an industry, I don't think I've seen too many operators that are involved at that level.
I have myself just returned from Antarctica, as was mentioned, and I was with Lindblad, which is a premier tour group, and I was surprised because this was the first time in my experience that the operators would say, "Stop! You're impinging upon the animal's welfare." It was specifically part of their agenda. And this was my first experience with that. Kelly, what is the answer to my question? What percentage of tour operators give voice to such sentiments?
I think it sounds like an excellent master's thesis or a PhD project, but I can say, certainly my experiences back in the 80s in the Terai of Nepal, where our guides would look for mating rhinos and decide that a good thing was to stir them up and have them run right past us for some reason. And that kind of behavior just isn't acceptable anymore. And I think the thing that social media has done in some ways is help sort of increase the observation qualities of people that are there for the right reasons, looking for a pure eco tour, and they call these people out. So I'm always a very optimistic person, and my optimism would say that that's happening less and less, but there are other issues. There's habitat loss. There are, I can recall a trip to the Galapagos when the guides, if you stepped off the trail, they were all over you, or you were sent back to wherever your dinghy that brought you there in the first place. And there are really good, opportunities like that out there, but we have different challenges now. We have increased populations, we have habitat loss, we have pollution, we have climate change. So that's adding a whole another layer of concern and responsibility, and that's where I see us sort of changing our approach and what kinds of problems do we have to deal with. I would say those kinds of inappropriate behavior are almost at the bottom of the list compared to some of the larger issues that we share today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I hope that everybody heard, the students in the audience, that there's an master's thesis or a PhD thesis to be gained to answer the question, how well are we doing? Let me ask the panels. Yes, Sir Harvey Lemlin.
David, I've been waiting 10 years to ask you this question because you asked it to me when I was doing my doctoral dissertation. Is Churchill's polar bear viewing industry ecotourism? Do you remember that discussion? It went on for 45 minutes between you and I.
I do remember the discussion, but Harvey, because of your research up there, I know it's a rhetorical question, is it, to a certain degree? You are so much better placed to answer that question than me because you did your PhD work up there. And I'm not passing the buck. I'll give you my sense, though. If we take the first principle there, if we're allowing animals, if we're containing them, if we're manipulating them, I would suggest that perhaps it's not ecotourism. But if we're allowing animals to approach, to free living, to move away on their own basis, then I think we're moving more towards a model of ecotourism. I've not been to Churchill, so I've not experienced it. Maybe with that thought in mind, you could add a little bit of substance to what you experienced up there along the basis of that first principle.
Well, not only did I research it, I lived there, and I still work on polar bears off and on as in my research capacities now. My biggest thing, as you will recall, was a profound lack of respect for the bears. Tourists would expect the bears to perform for them. And if the bears were lying there, which, if you know anything about polar bears, is the best thing for them to do. They have been fasting for 6 months. They should not be expending any energy. But the tourists would get mad, and Michael, I'll get back to you, because some of their expectations were based on these video footage that films were shot on, and people were expecting to see thousands of hours compressed into a couple of days of footage. So that was always my issue, the profound lack of respect. And since then, we've done research, and people do not feel it's their responsibility to do carbon offset. They don't feel it's their responsibility to learn about the community, learn about the indigenous people and the history of the region. So as I did back then, I still feel that Churchill is not an ecotourism destination. It is simply wildlife viewing. How it is won, people can dispute this because it has won, and some of the operators have won many ecotourism awards. But then we get into, as David talked about way back, the concept of greenwashing and exactly what is ecotourism. Under this new definition, where the profound ethics and respect and responsibilities involved, I feel that the industry falls quite flat on its face. And unfortunately, the larger issues, as you mentioned, climate change and the impacts from that are left off to the side because people just don't want to be made uncomfortable. And this is an issue we need to grapple with is, yes, they are ecotourists, yes, they are purchasing these tours and spending a lot of money, but they need to be told the truth and they need to be held responsible. I'm not saying that they need to be turned off, but they need to be aware that they are having an impact. And often what has happened in the past is, I'm an ecotourist, I don't have an impact. The tourists do, but I don't.
Let's try to drill this down to specifics. I love this. You've just laid out for us, Harvey, an agenda that we should take on and try to sort this out. David, you introduced a phrase I noted during your presentation about using the word interaction with animals, that the public, not only in ecotourism in the narrow sense, but in the broader sense of tourism focused on animals that you mentioned, that that often there's more than just viewing that the public wishes. They want some form of interaction. So let me ask all of you on the panel to sort of either by show of hands or by comment, is it possible for there to be any interaction other than the passive viewing and still have it be an appropriate endeavor that we would call ecotourism? Bernard Jacobi, let me ask you. You run the lodge in Tanzania focused on chimpanzees. Is it ever acceptable for tourists to interact with chimpanzees?
Not at all. Actually, even there's a code of ethic, or what is called the limit that you have to be at a certain distance from the chimpanzees and at the same time a specific number of individuals per group. So that means the interaction is not really acceptable.
Any other perspectives on this? Anybody else want to weigh in on say it's not acceptable? Tara Cornelise?
I think this is a really great place where insects can come in insect tourism. Of course, if it's handled well and by a trained ecologist or professional, they can actually pick up insects and hold them, in some cases be lightly bitten, as in the video that Michael showed. tour guide was being bitten by an army ant. And in that case, it doesn't really hurt that bad, but you can feel a sensation, and that's some way while the tour guides are explaining the ecological interesting behaviors of the insects that the tourists can experience that.
Kennedy Maggio.
Yeah, I also think we can still have a meaningful interaction between tourists and wildlife. All we need is some kind of visitor management techniques that will reduce an impact, the impact that tourists may have on those animals. Because sometimes we know what tourists look for. Tourists don't look for boring experiences, and some of these interactions and is really glued to what they want to
Give an example of what you would consider a meaningful and acceptable interaction.
For example, if a tourist is going to sit on let's say we have domesticated an elephant, and we want a tourist to experience this elephant ride. Or in Mexico, I have seen tourists, climbing on donkeys, and a tourist may want, for example, to kind of hit the animal, or make it run, or hold its ears, and make it do things. And if we have educated that tourist and told them, you will still go on top of the elephant, you will still ride on the donkey, but do not do X, do not do Y, do not do Z, and that can protect the animal. We still have the experience of the tourist, but we'll also ensure that the animal is not harmed.
I think this example obviously deserves comment. Carol Berman, what was your perspective?
Well, I just wanted to kind of put together some things that other people have said, and basically the idea is that we're talking about animals as if they're all the same. And the chimpanzees are very different from the insects. With chimpanzees, you have a very high danger of disease transmission, and many of the rules about not interacting with them and the distance that you stay from them is based on how far a sneeze or a cough can project microbes that cause disease. With insects, that's probably much less of an issue, and harming them is much less of an issue. So I think we need to, approach these things more specifically, and not just talk about animals, but talk about particular animals, and do research into what specific animal needs are, because they differ.
Excellent point. David, let me ask the question that most people consider obvious, but that isn't obvious in my opinion. Do insects have a different moral valence than vertebrate animals? And in your opinion, not just, because I know the majority opinion, in your opinion, and is the word respect that you mentioned as important, and Michael, the point of your presentation was to develop an ethic of respect for nature. Does it or does it not differ from insects to reptiles to mammals?
Well, for me, I think if you're going to adopt a culture of respect, if it's an individual respect or it's a culture of respect, that if you're going to respect nature, that you should respect nature on all levels. So I would certainly think that, and again, I'll go to the literature, that the literature suggests that there are differences, right, between chimpanzee and an insect. But I think it says something about us if we're willing to extend that boundary to incorporate all those entities that we deal with in nature, especially from an ecotourism standpoint. We can't say it's good for one and not necessarily good for the other.
My example of back off that penguin because you're disturbing it, you're altering its behavior, Tara, you suggested that doesn't apply to the insect. Michael Tobias, you were about to weigh in on this topic.
Well, let's face it, on every continent other than Antarctica, human beings, at least for the last 120, 130,000 years, have co-evolved with a number of species, needless to say. So the ethics of interaction in the Antarctic is completely muddled. No matter what we say here or do, there were never humans, as far as we know, in the Antarctic. And so everything we arbitrate is is really a dinosaur of future ethics, because we are weighing in on something that is outside the realm that we can actually know about. Southern elephant seals never co-evolved with hominids, so the whole thing is artificial to begin with. But on the other continents, and in the neotropics, for example, when David lifted up the army ant, explained what was happening, and then put it back, he was very careful and knowledgeable to reiterate, it was a reiteration, you saw it pronounced for the first time in the film, that this was a surgeon ant utilized by indigenous peoples who've been living in those forests for a long time. I would have to agree that every creature deserves our absolute admiration, respect, and companionship if we happen to be there in their presence, and I'm totally against meddling, intruding, and causing disturbance, notwithstanding the fact that every time I take a shower and every time any of us wash under our arms, we're killing 28 billion bacteria. So if you take a Jane position, for example, the shortest lived species on Earth that we know of has an 18-minute lifespan. And if you're going to apply the same ethical respect to that creature as you are to a mountain gorilla, then you are in the universe of a Digamber Jain monk, which, speaking personally, was going to be my destiny until I was told you have to go back and finish making a film about them. And I had a real dark night of the soul about this, and it hasn't ceased. So I'm still on the hook there, because I truly believe that an ethical approach to all life is at the basis of our salvation if we're going to proceed into the future.
Excellent, excellent the way you framed that, because I think you all will agree, it's not an easy question. And the point you made, Tara, it's not an easy question. And Carol, you're pointing out the animals, species are different. But if our agenda during these 2 days is to learn to get it right, I still think the question should be answered, is interaction an acceptable part of what should be going forward in the ecotourism industry? Carol Berman.
I just wanted to clarify that I don't think Tara or I were suggesting that we didn't have as much respect and didn't want to behave as ethically with insects as with chimpanzees, but that we realize that their needs and their limitations and their problems are likely to be different.
Right, about that I had no doubt. Kennedy.
If I could add to that,
Oh, I'm
too.
sorry, Tara.
Oh, thank you. And not only from the species perspective, but also from the human perspective, it's very different. You know, many people view chimpanzees differently than they view ants, and so there's much more tendency for people, you know, to go and squish ants without even thinking about them or thinking what they are. You know, many children grow up that way, and people continue that into their adult life. And so by providing that interaction, in some cases, it can really educate the person about that. And the video that Michael showed, for instance, the woman, you know, kept repeating, fascinating, fascinating, and, you know, maybe that will...
That was my wife.
Oh, your wife.
That was Jane. Yes.
Excellent, yeah, so she kept repeating fascinating. And so maybe that will, maybe not in her case, but in another person's case, have them think next time they go to potentially squish an insect about how unique they are and what unique behaviors they do have.
We didn't know that David, and there was no scripting, needless to say, we did not know, and you can imagine my thrill when David said, and love them, respect and love them.
Absolutely.
That was him, that was him.
I want to move this conversation on just a little bit, but just a few more comments. Terry Belke.
Yeah, and some of the reaction here that it seems that tourism is based a lot on expectation too, and I hope I'm not damning my own profession when I say this, but a lot of what people's exposure to nature these days seems to be through the media, and I think a lot of time, I often think that when say what Michael's done makes it look so easy, you go out and just, it's all there. Maybe that attitude needs to change too. You know, Harvey, you mentioned that what was going on with the polar bears, that people expected to see them almost, I thought you were going to say dancing at one point, but if they expect to see that, that is unreasonable, and maybe that's somehow that we need to take responsibility to change those expectations as well.
Good. Brian Grimore.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate some points that Terry made there, but I guess first off, I don't think I'm going to have any right or wrong answers during the week, but just maybe some probing questions. I guess it's not a week either, it's 2 days, but it feels like a week already. The first, though, is that this passive, this notion that passive viewing is ethically benign and morally benign, I think is something that we need to question.
Tell us why.
Well, just for the reasons that Terry brought up. and that I
Explain it
think
explain it to me as if I don't understand.
Well, and that I think Harvey was also pointed towards, and I think it's appropriate that I get to reference a graduate student of mine that I just finished supervising, who studied up in the polar bear tourism capital of the world in Churchill here, and looked at the various representations in various media, primarily websites of tour operators, and how that. How the polar bears were very much represented as this spectacle that led consumers to seek out those same sorts of representations or same sorts of performances and that they could capture on their camera. So they're expecting that, they're wanting to see it, and so that the actual viewing is of species takes place within a broader context of representational practices that people see through various media, whether it's promotional materials that companies distribute, whether it's social media, Facebook pages of friends that have visited a destination and reported on their stories up on social media. So the assumption that ecotourism and the viewing of wildlife is and passive viewing of wildlife is ethically benign, I think we need to question. But I also think we need to question, that moment of encounter, the broader sensory experiences. And the example of David and the ant is a great one, where from a moral perspective, those sensations have the capacity to, or create opportunities for enhancing our moral capacities in terms of relating on moral grounds with others. And there's some research that's coming out within tourism and broader fields of study that is speaking to this. Gordon Waite comes to mind in some recent tourism work, or Donna Haraway's work on companion species, and those moments of touch and those moments of broader sensory experience, and how that can shape our positive moral encounters, our moral compass, so to speak, with non-human
Very good.
others.
So thank you so much. Now, I do want to move on to topic. Just a segue a little bit as long as we have time. But I noted, by the way, and I hope everybody noted, that I've asked now 2 questions and I haven't got an answer to either of them yet. And but I'm an optimist, and I hope that by the end of our symposium that I will be able to come back around to you and re-ask the question: is it or should it be acceptable to interact? Well, I have in mind. Harvey, I'm going to ask you as we go through tomorrow what about specifics, but I have in mind that the ideal scenario is we observe at a great distance where we have evidence that we're, I hope, not altering the behavior of the animal. The animal's sleeping, we approach, we observe it, we leave it sleeping. The animal's feeding, we approach, we observe, we leave it feeding. That would be an example of not interacting, and the extreme alternative would be riding on the back of the animal. And blowing a horn to wake it up, or throwing a snowball to get it to look, it would be is the simple versions of what I have in mind. I would like you to make that more specific as we go through the program. But now, I do want to leave one other question out there, and I want to try to get an answer to it. David raised the question of whether hunting and fishing is an acceptable part of ecotourism. And it always pains me, by the way, it troubles me terribly that hunting is sometimes distinguished from fishing, because after all, fishing is just hunting fish. And we all know, and let's admit, that the capacity for suffering, the cognitive capacity of fish differs from mammals, but nevertheless, they have a capacity. Just as we were just referring before to insects, I don't know how to morally say that I'm supposed to respect a mammal more than respect a fish. I know the welfare concerns differ but the respect concerns and the interference concerns don't differ for me. So please answer for me, panelists, the question of whether hunting and fishing should be legitimately considered ecotourism. Tourism, surely. Nature focus, surely. Harvey Lemlin, you want to just give a yes or no answer? I'm sorry, Kelly. Kelly Bricker.
I've been involved with International Ecotourism Society since 2000, and the organization has been in existence since 1990, so just after David started doing his work. And in that 25 years, we never distinguished between consumptive and non-consumptive use of animals in the ecotourism product. And only recently, about the last couple of years, we've been looking at research and looking at what's happening in the use of the term ecotourism, and decided it's time to make a more of an emphatic statement about this. And so very clearly now in our definition, it is non-consumptive and non-extractive as part of a ecotourism product. Hunting is hunting, fishing is hunting and fishing. And everything else in between is what it is, but it's not in our organizational capacity to define ecotourism and represent it. We do not believe that it is.
At least going forward, your organization, who more than anyone controls the word, the name ecotourism, is saying let's leave hunting as another topic. Okay, anyone want to speak to that? Harvey?
Well, I'm kind of shocked to hear this because I'm still, I thought non-consumptive was a fallacy that we kind of dealt with in academia. There's been research on birding, and as Brian was alluding to it, even with the best intentions, some birds are displaced by birders who don't want to harm the animals but end up displacing mating couples, and the youngs die. So to me, that would be a consumptive aspect of a so-called non-consumptive activity. Animals have been squished, small mammals have been squished by tundra vehicles on their way to go see polar bears, so that would mean to me it's consumptive. The idea that one activity is non-consumptive and one has been heavily debated. Zoe Melitus and other people have wrote a wonderful article on that. So I guess what I find is I remember one hunter who went in who was telling me, looking at the scales that David and other people helped to develop, and said, I know what your scale is about. It's about ecocentric versus anthropocentric, and I'm going to end up being anthropocentric because I fish and I hunt. And he goes, I challenge you to ask anybody on this buggy who knows more about nature than I do, just because I hunt and I use fair chase. That was his an animal. So whether or not it should be excluded, I work with indigenous people. They view hunting and viewing very differently. Sometimes they feel that the viewing is very disrespectful, and Brian can attest to this. He's worked with Inuit people. If the animal shows itself to you, you are supposed to harvest it. So there are all these cultural nuances. Perhaps we're academics and saying it's not easy cut. I don't believe that there's such a thing called non-consumptive, and I'm just going to go on record with that one. So ecotourism is consumptive. It does have an impact. It is not omnipotent. It does walk on the soil. It does have an impact in the water and in the air because most people fly there. So
I'm so glad you made that point. It's so often the case that I see animals displaced by tourists that ignoring that cost, one could maybe put a low value to the cost, but ignoring that cost is a mistake. And thank you very much for making that point. So, but now whether or not the word consumptive applies in that case or is something we'll debate. So for those of us who are listening, and including me, clearly what seems to be easy questions are in fact very difficult, and that's why we're struggling. Let me ask. We only have a few more minutes, but let me ask one other question that came up that certainly fell to me as I listened to these two wonderful talks. Is it, in your opinion, panelists, possible to convey a respect for nature to clients who did not come to you as desiring a lesson about respect for nature? They come because of the adventure, the entertainment. But, so is it possible? Is it possible to do passive and/or active education with these clients and actually move the bar? David?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer for me is that I think it's their responsibility to, right? That should be first and foremost in conveying to ecotourists what is appropriate behavior in the field. So if they're not, that's problematic. But keep in mind that this is often situational. As I've often said to my students, it's kind of like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde syndrome. Is that we show up as ecotourists to these places, and then we suddenly change into this environmental being. And then, we're expected from a cultural standpoint, again, from a situational standpoint, to act a certain way. And we conform to that. We act that way. But then when we remove ourselves out of that environment, we get back to our place of residence and a place of work, that we change again back to that other self. So I think the main task here is that we are supposed to impart some lessons. We are supposed to pass on some nuggets of information that we would hope, not only situationally, but that these individuals would take back with them to their place of residence to change their views of what sustainability means, or responsibility, and our relationship with the environment.
So what a wonderful what a wonderful answer, and what a wonderful way to give us an agenda for tomorrow. So I'm going to do my best to keep us on time, and we're about running out of time. So for those of you who are viewing and those of us in the audience, we have just started the conversation, and we have, as you see in our program, a wonderful list of speakers and additional topics tomorrow. I frame this panel discussion as, is it possible to do this correctly, to have ecotourism run correctly? I heard optimism in the answers, and I'm going to say the answer is yes, it is possible, but we have challenges before us, and maybe we'll tackle those challenges tomorrow. So until tomorrow at 9 a.m., thank you very much for coming. Thank you, panelists. Thanks, everyone.